The day Belle Dugan decided to give away everything she owned began like any other morning on the Dugan Range, with the smell of cattle dust and frying salt pork drifting through the open window of the grandest house in Cobb County, Texas, in the long hot summer of 1882. Belle stood at her bedroom window in the pale blue hour before full sunrise, watching the hands move across the yard below, her dark hair still loose around her shoulders, her eyes carrying that particular shade of restlessness that her father, Harlan Dugan, had never been able to understand. She was 22 years old, and she had never once been asked what she wanted. Not truly asked, not in the way that required her father to sit still and wait for an answer that might inconvenience him. Harlan Dugan was a cattle baron in the truest and most absolute sense of the phrase. He owned 40,000 acres of rolling Texas grassland, a herd that numbered in the thousands, 3 line camps, a water tower in Sulphur Creek, and the undivided loyalty of every bank, sheriff, and merchant within 100 miles. He was not a cruel man by the standards of the time, but he was a man who had built everything from nothing through sheer unyielding will, and he saw that quality in himself as something so obviously right that he had never questioned whether it might make him wrong in other ways. Belle was his only child, and in Harlan Dugan's mind, she was the most valuable piece of property he possessed, though he never would have used that word even silently to himself. He loved her in the possessive, sweeping way that powerful men love the things they have produced. He had plans for her, very specific plans. Those plans had a name. His name was Clifton Marsh, and he was the second largest landowner in Cobb County, a widower of 38 with cold blue eyes and clean hands that had never done an honest day's labor. Harlan intended to combine the Dugan Range with the Marsh holdings and create an empire that would stretch from the Rio Picos to the Nueces, and he intended to accomplish this through the marriage of his daughter to a man she found deeply, fundamentally wrong. Belle had met Clifton Marsh 4 times and had disliked him more thoroughly with each meeting. He spoke to her the way a man speaks to a piece of furniture he is considering purchasing, evaluating dimensions and finish, noting flaws. He had patted her hand at their last supper together the way you pat a horse you're thinking of buying, and she had smiled through it because her father's eyes had been watching from across the table with that particular warning in them. On that July morning in 1882, with the sun barely cresting the eastern ridge and the mockingbirds going mad in the cottonwoods, Belle had not yet met Perry Quinn. She did not know he existed. She did not know that before the week was out, everything she understood about herself and what she was willing to sacrifice would be turned completely around. Perry Quinn arrived in Sulphur Creek on a Thursday with 40 cents in his pocket, a bedroll tied behind a borrowed saddle on a horse he'd won in a card game in San Angelo 3 weeks prior, and no particular destination in mind. He was 26 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with dark eyes that noticed everything and a mouth that was slow to smile but sincere when it did. He wore his hat pushed back on his head and rode like a man who had grown up on horseback, which he had, on a small scrub ranch in the hill country that had dried up and blown away by the time he was 19. He had spent the 7 years since doing the work that drifting men do in West Texas. He'd driven cattle up to Abilene twice. He'd fenced line for a spread near Fort Stockton. He'd done a season of rough stock work for a rancher outside Marfa who paid fair. He'd worked a mule train through the mountains east of El Paso. He'd never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, not because he was running from anything in particular, but because nothing had ever been compelling enough to make him stop. He tied his horse at the rail outside the Sulphur Creek dry goods store and went inside to see if 40 cents would buy him anything worth eating. The store smelled of beeswax and tobacco and ground coffee, and the man behind the counter looked at him the way storekeepers in small Texas towns always looked at strangers, which was to say with calculation and suspicion in equal measure. Perry bought a small sack of dried beans and a 1/4 pound of coffee, and had exactly 7 cents left, which he put back in his pocket without expression. He was walking back toward his horse when he heard the argument. It came from the alley between the general store and the saddle shop next door. A woman's voice, sharp and controlled, saying something firm, and a man's voice over it, louder, with that particular edge of entitlement that Perry had always found deeply irritating. He stopped walking. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that thoroughly and with conviction. Then he walked around the corner of the building into the alley. Belle Dugan was standing with her back against the saddle shop wall, her chin up, her eyes blazing, and her hands in tight fists at her sides. She was wearing a riding skirt and a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she looked absolutely furious. The man she was furious at was one of Marsh's hired hands, a wide-shouldered fellow named Breck, who was standing too close to her and had his hand braced against the wall beside her head in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Mr. Marsh just wants a word with you," Breck was saying. "That's all. He's waiting over at the hotel and he sent me to fetch you." "I am not something to be fetched," Belle said very clearly. "Take your hand off that wall." "Now, Miss Dugan, take your hand off that wall," Perry said. "You heard the lady." Both of them looked at him. Breck turned slowly, sizing him up with the practiced eye of a man who has done his share of intimidating. Perry stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression completely neutral, which was sometimes more unsettling than anger. "This is a private conversation," Breck said. "It didn't sound private," Perry said. "It sounded like one person talking and another person not listening. I've got poor hearing for arguments like that." Breck stepped away from the wall and toward Perry, and Perry saw him calculating, weighing the odds, looking at Perry's lean frame and worn clothes, and deciding that the calculation came out in his favor. Perry could see the exact moment the man decided to push it. He was wrong to decide that. Perry had not won 7 years of survival on the drift by being soft, and when Breck reached for him, he moved with a speed that caught the bigger man completely off guard. It ended quickly and without gunfire, which Perry considered the only worthwhile way for a fight to end, and Breck sat down in the dust of the alley with his hand over his nose and his eyes watering. "Tell Mr. Marsh the lady wasn't interested," Perry said pleasantly. Then he turned to the woman against the wall and discovered she was looking at him with an expression he had not expected, which was not gratitude exactly, but something more interesting than that. Something closer to assessment. "I had that under control," she said. "I know," he said. "I just sped things up a little." Her eyes moved over him once quickly, the way she might evaluate an unexpected situation. Then she said Belle Dugan and held out her hand. He took it. "Perry Quinn. You're not from around here." "No, ma'am." "Looking for work?" He considered that for a moment. "Maybe." She looked at Breck still sitting in the dust, then back at Perry, and something shifted in her expression, a decision being made. "Come to the Dugan ranch tomorrow morning," she said. "Ask for Frank Hale, he's our foreman. Tell him Belle sent you. We're short 2 hands." Then she walked past him out of the alley and down the boardwalk with her back very straight and her boots clicking sharp against the wooden planks, and Perry watched her go, and thought that he had not intended to stay in Sulphur Creek at all, but that intentions were funny things. He showed up at the Dugan ranch at first light the next morning, because whatever he was not a man who went back on his word, even when the word had only been implied. Frank Hale was a barrel-chested man of 50 with a gray mustache and eyes like weathered oak, and he looked at Perry for a long moment after hearing Belle's name. "She sent you," Frank said. "She suggested I come," Perry said. Frank looked at his horse, his saddle, his hands, and his eyes. "You know cattle. I've driven 2 herds to Abilene and worked range fence in the Permian Basin for 2 seasons. Before that, mule trains and rough stock." Frank was quiet for another moment. $40 a month and found," he said. "You sleep in the bunkhouse, eat with the hands, and you don't make trouble." "40's fair," Perry said. He was assigned a bunk and turned his horse into the corral and went to work that same afternoon, and for the first 3 days he did not see Belle Dugan at all. He learned things about the ranch through the natural conversation of the bunkhouse. He learned that Harlan Dugan was a hard man who ran a tight operation and expected perfection from his people. He learned that the other hands respected Frank Hale without reservation. He learned that the relationship between the Dugan Range and the Marsh holdings was the primary subject of gossip, that everyone on the place knew about the expected marriage arrangement, and that opinion was divided on whether it was a good idea, with most of the older hands thinking it a fine business combination, and most of the younger ones keeping their mouths carefully shut. He learned that Belle Dugan rode every morning at dawn, alone or with one of the older hands, and that she knew the ranch as well as any foreman. He learned this last piece of information on his fourth morning, when he was sent out to check the fence line along the eastern pasture and found her already there, sitting on a buckskin mare named Clara, looking at a section of wire that had gone down in the thunderstorm 2 nights before. She glanced at him when he rode up. "Frank send you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Stop calling me ma'am. It makes me feel like my grandmother." He got down from his horse and went to look at the fence. The post had pulled out of the ground. He crouched and looked at the soil around it. "This post wasn't set deep enough to begin with," he said. "The storm just finished what was already coming." "I told my father that section needed reposting 2 months ago," she said. "He told me I was imagining things." There was something in her voice when she said that, not bitterness exactly, more like a woman who had learned to carry a heavy and familiar weight with composure. Perry looked up at her, and she was watching the broken fence with an expression he recognized, which was the expression of a person whose judgment has been consistently discounted by someone with authority over them. He got the spare post and wire from his saddlebag, because Frank Hale had sent him out prepared, and he set about fixing the fence properly. Belle dismounted and held the wire taut while he worked without being asked, which told him something about her. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then she said, "You handled yourself well with Breck." "It wasn't complicated," he said. "He's done it before," she said. "Intimidated women in town on Marsh's behalf. Nobody stops him because nobody wants trouble with Marsh." "I don't know anyone here," Perry said, "so I didn't know to be afraid of him." She looked at him steadily. "Are you afraid of things generally?" He thought about that honestly. "Sure," he said. "Wasted years, never finding a place that feels right. Things that matter slipping past while I'm not paying attention." He drove the post home with 2 firm blows. "Men like Breck, not particularly." She was quiet for a moment, and when he looked up she was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, but it had something in it that was warm and also sad, and he went back to his work and did not say anything else. She helped him string the wire and then remounted Clara, and before she rode off she said, "Thank you for doing it right. Most of the hands do it fast." "Fast and right sometimes come apart from each other," he said. She smiled then, for the first time, and it rearranged everything in her face in a way that was unexpected and startling, and then she was gone in a scatter of red dust down the pasture track. Perry stood with the fence post tools in his hands for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The trouble with Harlan Dugan started almost immediately, though Perry did not understand the shape of it until later. Harlan was a man who watched everything on his ranch with the vigilance of someone who has built something from nothing and lives in constant low-level fear of losing it. He noticed Perry the way he noticed all new hands, with assessment and suspicion, but Perry's competence was obvious enough that the assessment resolved quickly into cautious approval. What Harlan noticed that he did not approve of was something subtler. It was the way his daughter sat differently in the saddle after the eastern pasture morning. It was the way her eyes moved when she came back from her rides along the range fence, which Perry had taken to checking as part of his daily routine. It was a quality of attention in her that was new and pointed in a direction Harlan did not like. He said nothing at first. He watched. On the second Sunday, the hands who wanted to could ride into Sulphur Creek. Most did. Perry went too, because he needed to post a letter to a friend he'd ridden with in Abilene, and he sat afterward on the steps of the general store with a cup of coffee from the hotel dining room, watching the town. Belle appeared in the street, which surprised him, as she had not been in the group who rode in from the ranch. She must have come separately. She was with a woman closer to her mother's generation, stout and pleasant-looking, who turned into the dry goods store and left Belle on the sidewalk. Belle saw him on the steps. She crossed the street. "Miss Dugan," he said, and started to stand. "Sit," she said. "And I told you to stop with the miss." She sat down on the step beside him, which was not what women of her position typically did in public in a town where everybody knew her father, and Perry felt the social weight of it and filed it away. "What are you writing?" she asked, nodding at the envelope in his hand. "A friend in Abilene. We drove cattle together a few years back. He set down roots up there. Do you ever want that, roots?" He turned the envelope over in his hands. "I've been asking myself that question for 7 years, he said. "I think the honest answer is yes, but I've never found the right ground." "What would the right ground look like?" He looked at her. She was watching the street, her profile clean and serious against the white glare of the midday sun. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I know what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like somewhere you're only passing through." She nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already known. They sat in silence for a minute, which between them was not an uncomfortable silence, but rather the particular quiet of two people who have discovered they can inhabit silence together without it requiring anything. "My father has arranged for me to marry Clifton Marsh," she said, without ceremony, without looking at him. Perry said nothing. "The announcement is expected within the month," she said. "Marsh has been patient because he's getting a good deal, and patient waiting is easier when the deal is good. My father has been making promises." "What do you want?" Perry asked. She turned and looked at him directly, and her eyes were very dark and very certain and very tired all at once. "Nobody asks me that," she said. "I'm asking." She was quiet for a long moment. On the street, a wagon went by with a dog trotting underneath it. "I want to run the ranch," she said at last. "I know that land better than my father does in some ways. I know where the water runs in dry years and which pastures need rotating and which lines need reposting. I know which of the hands can be trusted and which ones cut corners." She paused. "I want to be asked my opinion instead of having my opinion replaced. I want to matter to the place I come from in a way that isn't just about who I marry next." Perry listened to all of this. "And Marsh," he said. She looked away. "Marsh sees a merger. He would not know what to do with a woman who had opinions about fence posts." She stood up from the step and shook out her skirt. "Forgive me. I don't usually talk like this to people I've only known a week." "You talk to people the way you fence post," he said. "You do it right instead of fast." She looked down at him, and that smile came again, the one that rearranged her face, and this time it stayed a little longer before she put it away. "Good afternoon, Perry Quinn," she said. "Good afternoon, Belle," he said, and her name sat very naturally in his mouth. She walked back across the street to find her companion, and Perry finished his coffee and watched the street, and felt something in his chest that was new and inconvenient and entirely beyond his experience managing. The following weeks had a particular quality to them that Perry would remember for the rest of his life. There was the work, which was good, which was solid and honest and satisfying in the way that outdoor labor can be when it is done with competence. There were the long days in the saddle-checking range, and moving cattle and mending what needed mending. There was the bunkhouse in the evenings with the other hands playing cards and talking and telling lies that everyone knew were lies but that were entertaining anyway. And there were the mornings. It became an established thing without either of them formally establishing it, the way real things sometimes happen. Belle rode at dawn, and Perry's routine put him in the eastern and northern pastures in those early hours, and their paths crossed with a regularity that could not be called accidental after the third time, but that neither of them directly addressed. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up on the Dugan Range, being the only child of a man who had poured all his ambition into building something, and had discovered too late that he had not poured equal energy into the person beside him while he built it. Her mother had died of a fever when Belle was 11, and after that it had been just Harlan and Belle, and Harlan's answer to grief had been more work and more acquisition, and Belle had learned to find her own company on horseback across the land she loved. Perry told her about the hill country where he'd grown up, the small dry ranch where his father had fought the land and lost slowly over many years, the way watching that slow loss had made him afraid to put everything into a single place, the way the drift had been partly freedom and partly running. "What were you running from?" she asked one morning, sitting her horse beside him at the edge of the north pasture while the sun came up orange and enormous over the rimrock. "Not knowing if I had what it takes," he said, "to build something, to stay." "What does it take?" "I used to think it was land or money," he said. "I'm not sure that's right anymore." She looked at him sideways, and the sunrise was full in her face, and she was so completely and absolutely beautiful in that light that Perry looked away at the cattle in the pasture below, because there was a limit to how long he could look at something that extraordinary without showing something he wasn't sure he had the right to show. Harlan Dugan saw what was happening with the eyes of a man who has spent decades reading ranges and weather and the behavior of animals and of men. He saw it with clarity and with a cold and rising anger. He sent for Frank Hale one evening after supper. "The new hand," Harlan said. "Quinn." Frank Hale's face was carefully neutral. "Good worker, solid, the animals like him. I noticed my daughter rides the same range he checks every morning." Frank said nothing. "I pay you to run this ranch and to keep things orderly," Harlan said. "Quinn can stay, but his routes change as of tomorrow. Put him on the south pasture, the far south. Give him the dry camp work." Frank Hale looked at his boss steadily. "Yes, sir," he said. The dry camp was hard, isolated, unglamorous work. Perry rode out to it without complaint because it was work and he was hired to do it, and because he understood exactly why he'd been assigned there, and he was not going to make Harlan Dugan's point for him by objecting. He was gone for 11 days. Belle noticed. She didn't say anything to her father, because she had learned the futility of direct confrontation with Harlan Dugan on subjects he had already decided. But she noticed Perry's absence with a sharpness that surprised her, a daily awareness of something missing from the routine of the mornings that went beyond the professional and into something she had not given herself permission to fully name yet. She found Frank Hale on the 12th day. "When does the dry camp rotation come back?" she asked. Frank looked at her with those weathered oak eyes. "Another week, maybe," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Did my father send him out there?" Frank was a man of great loyalty and great honesty, and those two things were currently in direct conflict, and Belle saw it on his face. "Thank you, Frank," she said. "That's answer enough." She went back to the house and sat with her father at the supper table that evening, and watched him talk about cattle prices and the railway extension that was coming through the county. And she thought about 11 days, and why 11 days of an absence should feel the way it felt. And she thought about Clifton Marsh's cold blue eyes and his evaluating hands, and she made some decisions in the quiet of herself that she did not yet share with anyone. Perry came back from the dry camp on a Thursday with dust in his hair, and his horse needing a rest, and a good feeling in his chest from 11 days of honest solitary work that had given him a great deal of time to think. He thought clearly in open spaces. He always had, and 11 days of dry camp thinking had produced a clarity that he found both terrifying and simple, which was that the right ground, the ground he'd been unable to find in 7 years of looking, was here. It was specific. It was a woman with dark eyes and strong opinions, and a way of talking about fence posts and land and water rights that was more interesting to him than anything he had encountered in 7 years of moving through the wide and varied world. He was not a man given to self-deception, and so he did not try to dress this knowledge up as something other than what it was. He unsaddled his horse and put her in the corral and went to the pump to wash the dust off, and then he went to find Frank Hale to report that the south pasture cattle were in good shape and the fence lines were sound. He was crossing the yard when he saw Belle coming out of the barn, carrying her saddle to hang it up after an evening ride. He crossed to her without thinking about it and took the saddle from her arms, which was heavy, and she was carrying it with effort. She looked up at him, and for a fraction of a second there was something completely open in her expression, something undisguised, and then the composure came back. "Welcome back," she said. "Good to be back," he said, and meant it in more ways than he intended to say right then. He hung the saddle on the rack inside the barn door, and they stood in the warm smell of hay and horses, and he turned to face her, and she was closer than he expected, and neither of them moved away. "He sent you to the dry camp," she said. "It's work that needed doing," he said. "Perry." "Belle." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to know something," she said. "And I need to say it plainly because I am not a woman who does well with indirection." She paused. "I am aware that you have no money and no land and no particular prospects, and I want you to know that I find that to be the least interesting thing about you." Perry was quiet for a moment. The barn was dim and golden with evening light coming through the slats, and somewhere outside a mockingbird was making the sound it made at dusk. "Belle," he said carefully. "Your father, I know what my father wants," she said. "I know it very well. I've known it for 2 years. What I'm saying to you has nothing to do with what my father wants." He looked at her face, serious and decided, and he felt the weight of what she was saying and what it would cost her and what it would ask of him. "I have 40 cents, he said, and then corrected himself. "I have $40 now, month's wages. I have a horse I won in a card game and a bedroll and 7 years of range work experience." "I know what you have," she said. "Belle," he said again, and his voice was lower now. "I don't think you've thought about what walking away from all of this looks like." "I think about it every morning," she said. "I think about it every time my father discusses Clifton Marsh with the same tone he uses for discussing the price of beef. I think about it when I ride this land that I love, and I think about the fact that loving something is not enough to make it yours." She took a breath. "I am not impulsive. I am not romantic in the foolish sense. I have thought about this more carefully than I have thought about anything in my life." Perry reached out and very slowly pushed a strand of dark hair back from her face, and she was perfectly still under his hand, and he said, "I am going to court you properly if you will allow it, Belle Dugan. I am going to talk to your father." She almost laughed. "My father will fire you." "Probably," he said. "But I've been fired before, and I've never been sorrier for it." He talked to Harlan Dugan the next morning. Harlan received him in the main room of the house, standing behind his desk the way he stood behind it when he intended to make clear the power differential between himself and whoever was standing on the other side of it. He was a tall man gone to gray, with big hands and a jaw like a shelf of granite, and he looked at Perry with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was not far from it. Perry stood with his hat in his hands and said what he had to say directly, which was that he had feelings for Belle, and that he intended to pursue her acquaintance honestly and openly, and with full respect for her, and for her father's home. Harlan listened to the whole of it without interrupting, which Perry had not expected and which he later realized was a sign of the man's intelligence. He was gathering information before deciding on a response. "You have no land," Harlan said. "That's correct. No money to speak of. $40. No family connections of any relevance." "My family is gone," Perry said. "The ranch in the hill country dried up. I've been on my own since I was 19. Harlan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Quinn, I respect a man who says what he means to my face. I'll give you that, and you're a good hand. Frank Hale thinks well of you, and Frank Hale's opinion of men is not lightly given." He paused. "But my daughter is not available to a drifting ranch hand with $40 and a borrowed horse. I've worked 40 years to build what this family has. I'm not going to stand by and watch it join to nothing because my daughter finds you interesting." "With respect," Perry said, "I'm not asking to join anything. I'm asking to know your daughter better, openly and honestly, which is the respectful way." "The respectful way," Harlan said, "is to recognize that she is spoken for and to direct your attention elsewhere." "She doesn't see it that way," Perry said. Harlan's jaw tightened. "You're done here," he said. "I'll have Frank pay you through the end of the month. I want you off this ranch by sundown." Perry nodded. He put his hat on. "I'll go," he said. "But I'll tell you something, Mr. Dugan. Your daughter is the finest woman I've ever known, and she is not a business arrangement, and the day you finish treating her like one you might find you haven't lost as much as you think you have." Harlan said nothing. Perry walked out of the main house and across the yard and went to tell Frank Hale what had happened. Frank listened. He handed Perry a sealed envelope with his wages. "Where will you go?" Frank asked. "Into town," Perry said. "I'll get a room at the hotel for a few days and figure out my next step." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a good woman." "I know," Perry said. He was saddling his horse when Belle came across the yard at a half-run, her skirts in her hands, her face set and her eyes very bright. "He fired you," she said. "Yes." "Perry, it's all right," he said. "It's not all right." She was standing close to him, her hands gripping the top rail of the corral fence. "It is absolutely not all right. You went to him honestly and openly because that's the kind of man you are, and he threw you off the property because that's the kind of man he is, and none of this is all right." He turned from the saddle and looked at her. "I'll be in Sulphur Creek," he said, "at the hotel. I need to figure out my next step. I'm not going anywhere further than that." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her making decisions behind her eyes. "Give me 3 days," she said. He did not know what she meant by that exactly, but he said, "All right." Those 3 days were among the longest of his life. He took a room at the Sulphur Creek Hotel, which cost him $12 and left him with 28, and he had nothing to do but think and wait, which was not in his nature. He found work at the livery stable by the second morning, because he was constitutionally unable to sit idle, and he spent the days mucking stalls and shoeing horses and listening to the talk of the town, which was not a great deal of talk because Sulphur Creek was a small town, and small towns are perversely quieter about their major events than big ones. On the third day, Belle rode into town at noon. She came alone, which was remarkable, because Belle Dugan did not typically ride into Sulphur Creek unchaperoned. She tied Clara at the hotel rail and went inside and asked for his room number at the desk, and the clerk gave it to her because she was Belle Dugan and her father owned most of what the hotel clerk's employer owed money to. She knocked on his door. He opened it, and she was standing in the corridor with her hat in her hand, and her riding clothes slightly dusty from the road and her expression determined in a way that made his chest contract. "May I come in?" she said. "The door stays open," he said, which was proper and correct for 1882 in a hotel corridor in a small Texas town, and she nodded. She came in and stood by the window. "I talked to my father for 2 hours last night," she said. "And I have talked to the family lawyer this morning, which was a significant thing to do because he is my father's lawyer first and mine second, but I asked him specific questions about specific things." Perry leaned against the wall and watched her. "The ranch," she said, "is legally my father's to do with as he chooses. There is no part of it that is mine in any legal sense. He can leave it to Marsh's holdings through my marriage, or he can leave it to a stray cat, and there is nothing I can do about that." She paused, "But there is a piece of land, about 300 acres on the north edge of the Dugan Range, along Cutter Creek, that came to me directly from my mother's family when I turned 21. It is mine in my own name. My father cannot touch it." Perry looked at her carefully. "My mother's people had a small ranch in the hill country," she said. "They sold it when my grandfather died, and the money was put in trust for me. When I turned 21, I had the choice of taking the money or using it to purchase land. I chose the land because my father's lawyer helped me, and I got 300 acres along Cutter Creek at a good price because it was before the railway came through and the values went up." She looked at him steadily. "It is creek-fed land, it has good grass, it is small, but it is honest land, and it is mine." Perry was very still. 300 acres is not a cattle empire," she said. "We could not run the kind of operation my father runs. We would have to build from scratch, and it would be slow, and there would be years of hard work and uncertainty, and it would not be grand." She took a breath, but it would be hours. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she met his eyes without flinching. "Belle," he said, "you are asking me to let you give up 40,000 acres for 300. I'm asking myself that," she said, "not you. You haven't asked me for anything. What does your father say?" "My father does not yet know about the Cutter Creek land," she said quietly. "He has forgotten about it, or perhaps he never fully understood it. It was my mother's business and my grandfather's arrangement, and he was focused on other things at the time." She paused. "When I leave his house, I will not leave with his blessing. I will leave with 300 acres of creek land, and whatever I can carry in a saddlebag, and the knowledge that I am doing the only thing that makes sense to me." Perry looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light came through the hotel window and lay across the floor between them in a warm rectangle. "I can't give you what your father can give you," he said. "I want you to hear that clearly from me." "I know what you can give me," she said. "You gave it to me in pieces over several weeks, and I paid attention." He reached out and took her hand, both of them, her hands in his, and she looked down at them and then up at his face. "I will build you something," he said quietly. "Not overnight. Not with promises I can't back up. But I will build you something solid and true if you give me the chance, and I will work every day of my life to be worth what you're giving up." She squeezed his hands once, firmly, the way a woman who has made a decision confirms it. "Yes," she said. It was not the last word that needed saying, not by a long distance. But it was the word that mattered. They went to see the Reverend Aldous Cray at the small Methodist church at the edge of Sulphur Creek the following morning, because Belle had thought this through completely, and she knew that doing things properly and lawfully was the only way to do them without regret. Reverend Cray was a thin, thoughtful man who had been in West Texas long enough to have married widows to drifters and farmers to ranchers' daughters before, and who understood that the frontier made different arrangements necessary than the drawing rooms of the East. Belle told him plainly that she was of age, that she was acting of her own free will, and that she intended to marry the man beside her. Reverend Cray looked at Perry, and Perry looked back at him without performance, just directly and steadily. "I have nothing to offer her materially except work and honesty," Perry said. "I intend to provide both in full measure for the rest of my life." Reverend Cray looked between them for a long time, and then he said that he would post the banns and that a wedding could be arranged within the week. Belle was the one who told her father. She went back to the Dugan ranch that afternoon and found him in the yard and stood in front of him in the flat white July sun and said what she had to say. She told him she was marrying Perry Quinn. She told him about the Cutter Creek land. She told him she was not asking his permission. Harlan Dugan went very still. He said things then that Belle had feared he might say, and that cut her in ways she had prepared for, but that still hurt, because father's words carry a particular weight even when the fathers are wrong. He told her she was throwing her future away. He told her the man was a nobody. He told her that she would regret it, and that when she did, she should not expect to come back to him for rescue. Belle stood very straight throughout all of it. "I love you, Papa," she said, when he had finished. "I love this ranch and everything it means. I love what you built and how you built it, but I am not a piece of this ranch. I am your daughter, and I am choosing my own life, and I hope that one day you will understand why." She went into the house and packed 2 saddlebags with the things that mattered to her, which included her mother's silver brush, a Bible that had been her grandmother's, 2 changes of clothing, her writing tools, and a tin box that contained the deed to the Cutter Creek land. She carried them out to the yard and tied them to Clara's saddle. Frank Hale was standing by the barn. He watched her, and his eyes were carefully still. "I'm sorry, Frank," she said. "Don't be," he said quietly. He crossed to her and held Clara's bridle while Belle mounted, which was an act of respect and affirmation that meant more to her than she could say. "He's a good man, Miss Belle. I saw that in the first week." She reached down and touched his shoulder briefly. "Thank you for everything." She rode out of the Dugan ranch yard without looking back, which was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, because She loved that land the way you love something that has grown into your bones, and leaving it was like leaving a part of her own body behind in the dust. But she rode, and she kept riding, and by the time she reached the Sulphur Creek road, the pain of leaving had become something else entirely, something that felt like breath. Perry was waiting for her outside the hotel with his horse saddled and his bedroll tied, and a look on his face when he saw her coming down the road that he did not try to manage or contain. He went to her when she rode up and helped her down from Clara, and she stood in front of him, and he put his hands on her face, and she put her hands over his, and they stood like that for a moment in the street, in full view of the town of Sulphur Creek, neither of them caring about any of it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They were married 4 days later in Reverend Cray's church, with Frank Hale serving as witness, the only person from either of their previous lives who came. It was not a large wedding by any standard. Belle wore her best dress, which was blue calico and was several years old, and was also the most beautiful thing Perry had ever seen. Perry had bought himself a clean shirt from the dry goods store, which used most of the rest of his remaining money, and he stood at the front of that small church and watched her walk up the short aisle toward him, and thought that he had been moving for 7 years, and that he was absolutely done moving. When Reverend Cray asked if he took this woman, Perry said yes with a completeness that surprised even himself with its conviction. Belle said yes with her chin up and her dark eyes on Perry's face, and it was the most voluntary and decided yes she had ever said in her life. They spent their first night as husband and wife in the hotel, and on the following morning they rode out to see the Cutter Creek land for the first time together. It was a clear August morning, which is to say it was ferociously hot, and the creek was running low but running, and the grass along the bottom was pale gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek bank threw good shade. The land was gentle in its topography, not the dramatic rimrock country further west, but rolling and manageable, and Perry rode across it with the eye of a man who has spent years reading range, and he could see what it was and what it could be. "There," he said, pulling up on a slight rise above the creek. "That's where we build." Belle looked at the rise and at the creek below it and at the cottonwoods and the sky and the long reach of the land. "Yes," she said, "that's where." Building a life from 300 acres and a month's worth of wages is not a romantic proposition in the practical day-to-day. Perry knew this and Belle knew it better, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The first 2 months were the hardest in some ways, because the hardness was constant and detailed and required continuous improvisation. They pitched a canvas tent on the rise above the creek, while Perry began the foundation work for a proper structure. The tent was adequate in August and merely uncomfortable in September, and they filled it with their combined possessions, which was not a great deal, and they cooked over an open fire and hauled water from the creek, and Perry worked from first light to last light every day. Belle worked alongside him. This was not something he asked of her or expected. It was simply what she did, because she was a rancher's daughter and she knew how work was done. She helped him lay the foundation stones for the one-room cabin that would be their first house. She dug the kitchen garden in the creek bottom soil. She rode out every day to assess the land and understand where the good grass was, and where the ground held water in dry spells, and where the natural shelter was for animals in winter. She was extraordinarily good at all of it. This was not a surprise to Perry, who had watched her in the eastern pasture on the Dugan ranch and had known from the first morning that she understood range land the way most people understand weather, intuitively and with nuance. But it was a revelation to experience it as a partner rather than an observer. They talked constantly. Not the way that people talk to fill silence, but the way that two people building something together talk, practically and purposefully, with the easy shorthand that develops between two minds that find each other congenial. She had ideas about stock. He had ideas about water management. They argued about the placement of the well with a thoroughness that would have seemed absurd to an outside observer, but that was, in its way, completely absorbing and satisfying. He would say afterward that the tent months were in some ways the most purely happy of his life, which Belle found both touching and ridiculous, given that they were sleeping on the ground, and she had burned the beans 3 times in a row because cooking over an open fire was a skill she had never been required to develop on the Dugan ranch. "You're easy to please," she told him one evening, sitting outside the tent with the stars coming out enormous overhead. "I've been places where it was worse," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat watching the stars in the creek bottom cottonwoods, and there was in that moment a completeness and quiet that was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. "Do you regret it?" he asked. It was the question he asked her every few weeks because he needed to know and because he trusted her to answer it honestly. "Ask me again when the roof is on," she said. The roof went on in October, which was also when their first modest luck arrived in the form of a neighbor. Gideon Rowe had a small place 3 miles east along the creek, 250 acres, and he had been watching the activity on the old Cutter Creek land with curiosity since the summer. He rode over one October afternoon and introduced himself as a man of 50 with a kind face and an enormous gray beard and a handshake like a vice. He brought them a smoked haunch of venison as a welcoming gift, which was extremely welcome as their larder was sparse, and he sat on the new front step of their half-finished cabin and talked to them for an hour about the land and the county and the water and the cattle market. He had 3 grown sons in the county, he told them. He had come out from Missouri in 1864 when the war made Missouri a dangerous place for men of his particular political sympathies. He had built his place from raw land over 15 years. "Creek land is good land," he said. "Marsh has been trying to buy it off the Dugan estate for 2 years, but the old man wouldn't sell it." "It wasn't his to sell," Belle said quietly. Gideon looked at her with those kind eyes. "You're Harlan Dugan's girl," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, "and this land was my mother's family's and it is mine." He nodded slowly. "I heard there was a falling out," he said. Not unkindly, not with curiosity exactly, more with the simple acknowledgement of a man who knows that life is complicated. "There was," she said. He looked at Perry. "You planning to run cattle?" "Eventually," Perry said. "We need to build up first, start small." "I've got 2 heifers I'd sell at a fair price," Gideon said. "Give you a start, pay me when you can." It was the beginning of a friendship that was worth more to them over the following years than almost anything else they acquired. The cabin was finished before the first November frost, and it was small and bare in one room, but it was solid and tight in theirs, and Belle stood in the middle of it on the day they moved in from the tent and turned in a slow circle and looked at every corner of it and then sat down on the edge of their cot and was quiet for a moment. Perry watched her. "Well," she said at last, and her voice was not quite steady. 40,000 acres. She paused. 300. She looked up at him. "And not for 1 minute do. I want the other 39,700. He crossed to her and sat beside her, and she put her head against his chest and he put his arms around her, and they sat in their one-room cabin above Cutter Creek as the November wind began to move across the Texas plain. "Ask me again," she said. "Do you regret it?" he said. "No," she said, into his shirt completely, simply, and absolutely. "No." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold in that particular West Texas way, which is to say it came in fierce and unpredictable and did not leave when expected. Perry cut firewood until his shoulders ached and kept the cabin warm through the worst of it. Belle discovered she was pregnant in February, which she announced to Perry at breakfast one morning in the direct and unceremonious fashion that characterized all of her most important communications. He sat completely still for a full 5 seconds, staring at her, and then he broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on his face, which was wide enough to account for everything, and he came around the small table and lifted her off her feet, which made her laugh. "Perry Quinn put me down," she said, laughing. "In a minute," he said. He was a man who had spent 7 years with nothing and nobody to be responsible for except himself, and the weight of what was coming settled on him, not as a burden but as a purpose, something he had not known he was missing, and that had arrived with the force of something long waited for. The spring of 1883 brought the 2 heifers from Gideon Row and a third that Perry bought at a stock auction in Sulphur Creek with the last of his wages from the Dugan Ranch, which he had been carefully preserving. He spent the spring building a proper stock pen and a lean-to barn, and Belle spent the spring doing what she had promised herself she would do, which was learning to run a kitchen properly, because she was too practical to remain bad at something necessary. She was, characteristically, thorough about learning it. She corresponded with a woman in San Antonio who wrote a household column for the newspaper and acquired 2 good cookbooks through the Sulphur Creek post office. By summer she was genuinely capable, which she felt was a better accomplishment than she had expected. The baby came in October 1883 in the cabin, with the help of the doctor who rode out from Sulphur Creek, a capable and steady man named Fairweather who had been practicing in the county for 10 years. Perry was in the cabin throughout, which the doctor found somewhat unusual but which he did not argue against, because Quinn had a quiet authority about him that made arguing feel like a waste of time. The baby was a boy. They named him James after Perry's father. James Quinn came into the world with a strong voice and a determined expression and a thick shock of dark hair that was entirely his mother's, and Perry held him that first evening with the absolute carefulness of a man holding something irreplaceable, looking at him with an expression that Belle would remember for the rest of her life. "Well," Perry said quietly to the baby, "you picked good parents." "You are very confident," Belle said from the bed. "I am," he said, "on this specific subject." James was 6 months old in the spring of 1884 when Harlan Dugan came to Cutter Creek. He came alone, unannounced, on a morning in late April when the creek was running high from the winter rains, and the grass was as green as it ever got in West Texas, which was green enough to be almost startling after the brown of winter. He rode up to the cabin on a gray horse and dismounted at the hitching post, and Belle saw him from the kitchen window and went very still. Perry was in the stock pen. She could see him across the yard. She went to the door and opened it. Harlan Dugan was older than he had been in July. He had always been a big, solid man, but there was something slightly reduced about him now, as though the winter had taken a little of the granite out of him. He stood at the hitching post with his hat in his hand, which was new because Harlan Dugan did not typically come to anyone with his hat in his hand. "Belle," he said. "Papa," she said. They looked at each other across the yard, and the April wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and in the cabin behind Belle, James made a small sound in his sleep. Harlan's eyes moved to the sound, then back to her face. "Is it true?" he said. "I heard in town." "It's true," she said. "A boy. His name is James." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Perry had stopped working in the stock pen and was watching from the gate, and Belle felt the tension of his presence at her back, steady and certain. "May I come in?" Harlan said. She stepped back from the door. She brought her father into the cabin and put coffee on the stove and let him stand looking at the sleeping baby in the corner crib that Perry had built from creek cottonwood. Harlan stood looking at James for a long time, and his face, which had never in Belle's experience been easy to read, showed something she had not seen there before, which was loss. Perry came in from the yard and stood in the doorway. Harlan turned and looked at him. Perry looked back without aggression, without apology. "You've built this place solid," Harlan said. "It's still small," Perry said, "but it's sound. Frank Hale says you work like a man who means what he says." "I try to." Harlan was quiet for another long moment. Then he sat down at the table, which was an act of significant surrender for a man like him, an acknowledgement that this was someone else's domain. He looked at Belle. "I said things," he said, "when you left." "Yes," she said. "I want to take some of them back." Belle sat down across from him and poured the coffee and waited, because this was her father and she had learned very young how to wait him out. "I miss my daughter," Harlan said, which cost him considerably, and Belle could see the cost of it on his face. She looked at him across the table for a long time. Then she said, "I miss my father too." There was no dramatic reconciliation. Harlan Dugan was not a dramatic man, and Belle was not a woman who needed drama. What there was instead was the careful and tentative beginning of something that had been broken trying to heal itself, imperfectly and slowly, and with a great deal of silence on both sides, which was perfectly appropriate for two people of their particular personalities. Harlan left in the early afternoon. At the hitching post, he put on his hat and looked at Perry, and Perry met his eyes. "She is well," Harlan said. "She is better than well," Perry said. Harlan nodded once. He mounted his horse. Then he said, without looking down, "If you ever need a hand getting your herd started, Frank Hale knows what stock I'm rotating off the south pasture in the fall." He rode away before Perry could answer, which was how Harlan Dugan offered an olive branch at speed and without looking back, so that there was no chance of it being addressed directly. Perry stood watching him go and then went back to Belle in the cabin. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think he loves you," Perry said. "I think he's always loved you. I think he just loves you in the language of cattle and land, and you needed to be loved in a different language." She looked at him steadily. "You are unexpectedly perceptive," she said. 7 years of drifting," he said. "You learn to read people." By the fall of 1884, they had 7 head of cattle and a proper barn and a second room on the cabin and a baby who had learned to walk by gripping the leg of the kitchen table and who regarded the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's examining expression. They had neighbors they could trust and credit at the Sulphur Creek store, and a reputation in the county as a working outfit that was growing steadily. Marsh's holdings had expanded to the south, but Marsh himself had eventually married a woman from San Antonio who cared nothing for the land and who kept him occupied socially, and his attention to the Cobb County range had diminished. The threat he had represented to Belle's autonomy had quietly evaporated. The years that followed were, in the way of good years on working land, marked primarily by the accumulation of small specific satisfactions and 1 or 2 larger ones. The cattle herd grew. Perry proved to be a natural with stock, patient and intuitive, and he had an ability with horses that became locally known, and that supplemented their income during the lean years. Belle took over the bookkeeping and the correspondence and the planning of the operation with a thoroughness and intelligence that Perry relied on completely. "You're the better rancher," he told her once, which was probably the highest compliment either of them could imagine. "You're the better cowboy," she said, which made him smile. She was right in the technical sense. Perry Quinn on horseback was a pleasure to watch, and the younger hands they eventually hired regarded him with the particular admiration that working cowboys reserve for the genuinely skilled. He could rope with his left hand or his right. He could read cattle in a crowd the way a good shepherd reads sheep, and he understood horses the way some people understand music, instinctively and with love. In 1886, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara for Belle's buckskin mare, which the girl herself thought was extremely distinguished when she was old enough to understand it. Harlan Dugan came to Cutter Creek more regularly after James was born, and more still after Clara arrived. His relationship with his daughter was never precisely what it had been before, because what it had been before had not been entirely healthy, but it became something better, something more honest, based on mutual respect rather than authority. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable difficulty for a man of his particular formation, to ask Belle what she thought rather than telling her what to think. She learned to receive his visits with warmth rather than wariness. He never fully approved of Perry Quinn, but he respected him, which from Harlan Dugan was more sustainable and ultimately more valuable than approval. James was 4 years old the first time he sat on a horse, on Clara the mare who was old and patient, and Perry walked beside the horse with his hand on the boy's back, and Belle watched from the fence rail, and James was so thoroughly and completely in his element on horseback that Belle felt a pang of something that was not quite sadness but was adjacent to it, the recognition that her son had received something from his father that was beyond teaching. Perry saw her face. "What?" he said. "He looks like you," she said, "on a horse." Perry looked at his son. "He looks better than me," he said. "He's 4. He's going to be trouble," she said. "He's already trouble," Perry said fondly. Clara was 3 when she developed the habit of following her father around the stock pen, explaining her observations about the cattle, delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who has very important information that the world urgently needs. She had her mother's way of talking, direct and without preamble, and her father's patience. Perry listened to her with perfect seriousness, and Belle, watching from the kitchen window, thought that this was the thing she had known about him from the eastern pasture fence line, that he paid attention, fully and honestly, which was the rarest and most valuable quality in a person. The winter of 1887 was the hard one that everyone in Cobb County would talk about for 20 years afterward, when the cold came down from the north in November and did not lift until March, and the cattle losses across the region were brutal. Perry and Belle lost 8 head, which was significant and painful but not catastrophic, because they had spent the autumn building up the hay stores against exactly this kind of winter, and because Perry had moved the herd to the creek bottom shelter the day before the worst storm hit. "How did you know it was coming?" Gideon Rowe's youngest son asked him afterward, impressed. "I watched the sky the way my father taught me," Perry said. "And then I watched it the way experience teaches you." They tell different stories, but they both told the same story that day. Other ranches in the county lost far more. Marsh's holdings lost so much that 2 of his line camps were abandoned the following spring. The Dugan Range weathered it because it was large enough to absorb losses that smaller operations could not. Through the spring of 1888, Perry and Belle together made a decision that had been building for several years. They bought an additional 150 acres from Gideon Rowe's estate, which had come to his sons when Gideon died peacefully in his sleep that February, and the eldest son, who had decided to move to Abilene, was willing to part with his share at a fair price. 450 acres was still not Harlan Dugan's 40,000, but it was a real working ranch, and by the summer of 1888 the Quinn spread, as it had come to be known along Cutter Creek, was running 60 head and had a reputation for producing solid, reliable stock. In the fall of 1888, Harlan Dugan came to Sunday dinner at the Quinn Ranch, as he now did roughly once a month, and sat at their table, which was larger now than it had been in the beginning, and ate Belle's beef stew, which had become genuinely excellent, and drank Perry's coffee, and watched his grandchildren across the table. James was 5 and full of questions, and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that the sooner the eating is done, the sooner the interesting parts of the day can resume. Clara was 2 and sat in her chair with enormous dignity, and offered her grandfather bites of her biscuit with great ceremony, which Harlan accepted with a softness that had not been in his face when Belle was young. Harlan watched Perry carve the bread and answer James's questions simultaneously, and keep track of Clara's progress with her cup, and then he looked across the table at his daughter, and she met his eyes. Something passed between them that did not need words, the final settling of a long account. After dinner, when the children were abed and Perry was outside checking on the stock, Harlan sat at the table with his daughter and his coffee and said, "He is what I could not see him to be." Belle looked at her father. "A man who stays," Harlan said. "I thought staying required land or money or position. I thought those were the reasons a man roots himself." He paused. "I was wrong. He roots himself because of what he is. The land came after. The land always comes after." Belle was quiet for a moment. "You built this county," she said. "You built the Dugan name into something that will last 100 years. I am proud of that, and I am proud of you." She paused. "I just needed to be allowed to build something too." Harlan nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man who has arrived late at an understanding that was always available to him, and who knows the lateness but cannot undo it, and who is trying to make the arrival mean something anyway. Perry came back in from the stock check and refilled his coffee and sat down, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the lamp light, while the Texas night settled around the ranch. and the conversation turned to cattle prices and rainfall, and the railway extension that was coming through the county. And Harlan argued his position on steer weights, and Perry held his own position calmly, and Belle made a point about pasture rotation that silenced both of them. And the evening went on in the way of good evenings between people who have found their way through difficulty to something worth keeping. James Quinn, at 5 years old, had already decided he was going to be a rancher. Not a particular kind of rancher, not his grandfather's kind or his father's kind or anyone else's kind, but his own kind, which he was in the process of determining. He spent his days on the ranch with the purposeful observation of someone taking detailed notes for a project of great importance. He rode in front of his father on the big roan quarter-horse Perry had acquired the previous year, and Perry pointed out everything: the way the creek ran and why, the way the grass grew thick in one place and sparse in another and what it meant, the way cattle behaved when they were comfortable and when they were not. James absorbed this with a concentration that was very like his mother's and asked questions that were very like his father's, quiet and direct and getting straight to the point. Clara, for her part, had decided at 2 years old that she preferred the kitchen garden and the chickens to the cattle, and was working on a plan involving the number of eggs they could trade at the Sulphur Creek store. Perry encouraged this with the same seriousness he applied to James's interest in cattle. "You have a merchant," he told Belle. "I have a businesswoman," Belle corrected. "Same thing, not exactly." The Christmas of 1889 was the first one they spent with Harlan at the ranch, the first one where Belle did not feel the absence of the Dugan house as a loss, but simply as a fact of a life that had reorganized itself into something better. Harlan arrived the day before Christmas with a wagon of supplies he claimed to have been traveling past with anyway, which was transparently untrue, and which Belle thanked him for with a straight face. Frank Hale came too, retired now from the Dugan operation but still living in the county, and Gideon Rowe's 2 remaining sons came with their families, and the Quinn cabin, which was now 3 rooms with a proper parlor added on the front, was full of people and noise and the smell of food, and Perry stood in the middle of it all and looked across the room at his wife, and she caught his eye and smiled at him. And he thought about a Thursday morning in Sulphur Creek in July of 1882 when he had ridden into town with 40 cents and no particular destination. The particular quality of that thought was gratitude in its purest form. Not relief, not triumph, just the solid, anchored gratitude of a man who found what he was looking for without knowing he was looking for it, because he had not understood what he was looking for until it found him. Belle crossed the room to him through the noise of the gathered people and stood beside him and looked out the parlor window at the ranch in the December afternoon. "Do you remember the tent?" she said. "Every time I look at the roof," he said. She laughed. It was the laugh she saved for him, the unguarded one, nothing performative about it. "Perry, Belle, I want to tell you something I do not tell you often enough," she said. "You are a good man. You are the best man I have ever known, and this life is everything I wanted when I finally allowed myself to want something." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and through the window the Texas winter sky was enormous and clear and full of stars that were always there, but that showed best in the dark, and the Cutter Creek land lay quiet and solid under the cold sky. 300 acres expanded to 450 and solid underfoot, theirs in every way that mattered. James came running in from the back of the house looking for his father to show him something about the horses in the barn, which was urgent in the way that all 5-year-old discoveries about horses are urgent, and Clara was in the kitchen helping her grandfather, who had been recruited into flower-covered service, and the house was full of all the specific noise of a life that was real and full and grounded. Perry went with his son to see the urgent horse discovery, and Belle stood at the parlor window a moment longer, watching them cross the yard together, the man and the boy, and she thought about 40,000 acres and 300 acres, and about what you give up and what you gain, and about how those calculations look entirely different from one end of the bargain to the other. She had given up the Dugan Empire. She had been given in return the only thing the empire had never provided, which was the absolute certainty that she was known, fully and honestly known, by the person standing next to her. She went back to the kitchen to help with Christmas. The years continued to accumulate with the generous quality of time that is being well used. Perry Quinn did not become rich by any measure that counted money or acres as the primary unit. He became something else, which was necessary, which was embedded in the county the way the creek was embedded in the land, essential to the shape of things. He became known as a man whose word was a fixed point. When a younger rancher needed to know the truth about a horse trade or a water rights dispute, they came to Perry Quinn. When Frank Hale finally passed in 1891, it was Perry who helped carry him, and the old foreman's funeral brought more people out from the Dugan operation and the Rowe place and the surrounding ranches than anyone had expected, because Frank Hale had been known for being a man of integrity. And integrity in the Cobb County range was associated in those years with the Quinn outfit along Cutter Creek. Harlan Dugan died in the spring of 1893, peacefully, in the house he had built, with his daughter beside him. The Dugan empire passed to a nephew from Amarillo, as Harlan had arranged in his later years after changing his will, and the nephew sold most of it within 5 years, which was a thing that pained Belle more than she expected, but that she also understood as the consequence of Harlan having tried to make land do the work that people should have done. She rode over the Dugan range one afternoon the following summer, alone, on the old buckskin Clara, who was getting gray around the muzzle, but was still sound, and she rode the fence lines and the pasture tracks she had ridden as a girl, and felt the particular grief of a person returning to a place that has changed irrevocably. But she also felt under the grief the solid bedrock of her own place and her own life and her own people, waiting for her back along Cutter Creek, and she turned Clara for home before the sun got too low in the sky. Perry was at the gate when she rode in, which she had not expected, and he did not say anything, just took Clara's bridle while she dismounted and then put his arms around her, and she let herself be held for a long moment in the late afternoon light. "He loved you," Perry said. "I know," she said, "in his way was not nothing." "No," she said, "it wasn't." James was 10 by then and was becoming a real hand on the ranch, which Perry encouraged with a restraint and patience that was entirely his own, never pushing, always making space for the boy to find his own pace with the work. Clara at 8 was still primarily interested in the commercial arrangements of the egg trade, which had expanded into a modest business with the Sulphur Creek Hotel kitchen, and Belle watched her daughter negotiate with the hotel cook with a satisfaction that was profound. In 1895, they built the proper house. It was not large by any standard that Harlan Dugan would have recognized as significant, but it was a proper 2-story frame house with 4 bedrooms and a real kitchen, and a parlor that had windows on 3 sides and a porch that wrapped around the front and the east side and looked out over the creek bottom. Perry did much of the building himself with the help of James and 2 hired hands and a carpenter from Sulphur Creek, and it took the better part of a year. Belle stood in the finished kitchen the day it was complete and ran her hands along the counter that Perry had built level and true and looked around at the space, and felt a satisfaction so complete it was nearly physical. "It's a real house," she said. "It's been a real house since we put the canvas tent up," Perry said from the doorway. "The walls are new." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who had come into Sulphur Creek on a Thursday with 40 cents and a borrowed horse and had stayed, and who had built this, all of this, not out of money or land or any of the things her father would have said were necessary, but out of the thing her father had underestimated, which was simple and absolute persistence in the direction of what was right. "I love you," she said, which she said to him regularly and meaning it more each time, because that was the nature of the thing between them. It did not diminish with familiarity but deepened, the way a creek cuts deeper into stone the longer it runs. "I love you, Belle Quinn," he said, and smiled. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him with the door open and the ranch outside going about its business, and neither of them cared particularly. The Cutter Creek Ranch turned 15 years in 1897, by which time James was 14 and Clara was 12, and the herd was running well over 100 head, and the place had a reputation across 2 counties as an honest outfit run by honest people. They had added 40 more acres along the north edge, buying it from an estate that had been broken up, and the total of their land was now just under 500 acres, which was not the Dugan empire but which was theirs completely, and in every legal and practical sense. Perry hired a boy of 16 that year named Sam Ellis, an orphan out of the hill country, because he reminded Perry of a younger version of himself, and because he was a good hand, and because the ranch had room now for the help. Sam Ellis would work for the Quinn Ranch for 12 years and eventually marry Gideon Rowe's granddaughter and settle on a small place 2 miles east along the creek. And the Quinns would be witnesses at his wedding and godparents to his first child. And the creek country would accumulate families the way a healthy range accumulates grass, steadily, and with good root systems. In the summer of 1898, Perry Quinn sat on the porch of his house in the warm July evening, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge, and Belle came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, and James was in the barn doing the evening feed, and Clara had ridden over to the Rowe place to visit a friend, and the ranch was quiet with the particular satisfying quiet of a place where everything has been done that needed to be done today. Perry was 42. Belle was 38. They had been married 16 years. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who has worked hard for a long time, marked by weather and rope and fence wire and the 1,000 small demands of ranch work. He thought about the Thursday in July of 1882 when those same hands had held 40 cents and a sack of dried beans. Belle was watching the same sunset. "What are you thinking?" she asked, which was something she asked him occasionally because she was genuinely curious, because his mind was one of the things she found most interesting in the world. "I'm thinking," he said, "about all the places I passed through in 7 years that I could have stayed in but didn't. Are you glad you didn't stay in them?" "Profoundly," he said. She looked at him sideways, and the line of her face in the evening light was still, even at 38, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, which was partly because she was beautiful and partly because beauty of a certain kind, the kind that comes from character and intelligence and the accumulated weather of a life lived honestly, gets deeper with time rather than diminishing. "I heard something today," she said. "From the store. Clifton Marsh sold his last holdings south of the county. He's moved to Austin." Perry considered this. "Good for him," he said, which was charitable and probably more than strictly meant. "I was thinking," she said, "that there was a version of my life where I married him, where I stayed in my father's house and did what I was told and managed the combination of the 2 ranges and grew into an old woman who knew a great deal about cattle and nothing about herself." "That didn't happen," Perry said. "No," she said, "because a penniless drifter came into Sulphur Creek on a Thursday with 40 cents and bad timing and walked into an alley he had no business being in." "I had every business being in that alley," he said. "You had no idea who I was." "I knew exactly who you were by the time you said your name," he said. "I just didn't know the details yet." She smiled into her coffee cup. "Perry," she said, "Belle, do you still feel it, the rightness of it?" He turned to look at her fully, and his eyes on her face were exactly as they had been in a hotel corridor in Sulphur Creek in 1882, attentive and honest and missing nothing. "Every single morning," he said. "Sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, too." She laughed and shook her head and looked back at the sunset. They sat as they had always sat, in comfortable silence and in easy conversation, and in all the rich territory in between, while the Texas sky did what Texas skies do in the evening, which is to put on a display of color so extravagant that it seems impossible it will manage the same thing again tomorrow, and yet it always does. James came out of the barn and crossed the yard and went into the house for supper, pausing on the porch to say something to his father about one of the cows in the east pen, which Perry addressed briefly and accurately, and James nodded and went inside. Clara came home along the creek track in the early dark, her horse at an easy walk, singing something to herself that carried faintly across the distance. Belle listened to her daughter's voice on the evening air. "She has your mother's voice," Perry said. "My mother sang all the time," Belle said. "I had forgotten that." She was quiet for a moment. "I remember it now. She sang while she worked in the kitchen." Perry reached over and took her hand, and she turned her hand in his the way she had done for 16 years, by habit and by choice, and by the accumulation of 10,000 such gestures into the permanent language of their life together. "Clara is going to have a bigger life than this creek," Belle said. "She's going to go somewhere and do something remarkable. I can feel it in her." "Maybe," Perry said, "but she'll know where home is." "How do you know?" "Because we taught her," he said. "Home is not the biggest place you can get, it's the truest place. We taught her that." Belle tightened her hand around his. They stayed on the porch until the dark was full and the stars came out, and then they went inside to supper with their children. And the ranch night settled around the creek and the cottonwoods and the solid frame house above the water, and the cattle were quiet in the east pen, and Sam Ellis's lamp was burning in the bunkhouse, and the creek ran steady in the dark with the sound it had made since long before anyone had a name for this particular piece of the Texas plain. The Quinn Ranch along Cutter Creek went on for many more years after that July evening, growing slowly and honestly, and putting down roots that went deep as the creek itself. And the people who built it went on too, in the way of people who have found the place and the person that makes the world make sense. Belle Dugan Quinn, who had once stood at a window looking out at 40,000 acres she did not own in any way that mattered, found that 500 acres you understand and choose and love with your whole self is more land than most people ever stand on. She spent the rest of her life knowing exactly who she was and where she stood, which is the kind of wealth that cannot be inherited or sold or combined with a neighboring holding. And Perry Quinn, who had ridden into Sulphur Creek on a Thursday with 40 cents and a borrowed horse and no particular destination, found that he had been looking for the right ground for 7 years, and that it had been waiting for him the whole time, not as a place exactly, but as a life made specific by the presence of one particular person. He stayed. He always said, in the years that followed, that staying was the easiest thing he had ever done. Belle always said that was because he had not been paying attention to how hard she had worked to make it look easy. Both of them were right, which is probably the truest thing that can be said about a good marriage, and about the particular life they built together on Cutter Creek in the wide and honest country of West Texas, where the sky is bigger than anything you can lose and the ground holds whatever you are willing to put into it.